I found the box by accident. It wasn't hidden, not really. It just sat on the top shelf of the old wardrobe, dusty and slightly askew, as if someone had placed it there hurriedly and never looked back. I don't even know why I noticed it that afternoon. The sun was low, spilling golden streaks across the wooden floorboards, and a beam hit the box at just the right angle, making the blue ribbon tied around it glint faintly, almost teasing me. I pulled it down slowly, my fingers brushing away decades of dust, and the moment I held it in my hands, I felt the weight of something that wasn't purely physical. It was heavier than a box of paper, heavier than memory itself, heavy with unspoken words, unclaimed confessions, quiet regrets. I untied the ribbon, careful, almost reverent, and lifted the top lid. Inside, neatly stacked, were dozens of envelopes, each addressed to me. My name, written in the hand I knew too well, looping and deliberate, and yet none of them bore a stamp, none of them had ever been mailed. My chest tightened. My hands shook, not from the dust or age, but from the electricity of realization. She had written to me, over and over, for years, and had never sent a single word. She had kept her letters as one keeps a secret, a confession meant for the night or for her own understanding, and yet here they were, now mine by accident or fate. I sank onto the floor, leaning against the wardrobe, the box in my lap, and the first envelope fell open in my hands, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and old ink, a scent that made my heart jerk with memory I hadn't realized I still carried. I began to read. Her words unfolded slowly, cautiously, but with the kind of intimacy that burned straight through the chest, leaving nothing untouched. There was no blame here, no bitterness, only a desperate attempt to understand, to reach out across a chasm that neither of us had ever dared to cross fully. I read about her mornings, the quiet ones when she stared at the ceiling and thought of me, about the nights she wrestled with words she would never say aloud, about the doubts that gnawed at her, the things she feared I would never understand. I could hear her voice in the pauses, in the small circles she drew at the end of each line, in the way her punctuation trembled when she was uncertain. It was as though she had folded herself into these letters, carefully, painfully, and tucked them away, afraid the world, or I, wasn't ready for them. The first tear came before I even finished the opening paragraph, a single, hot drop that fell onto the paper. I brushed it away quickly, embarrassed, absurd, like some foolish man caught eavesdropping on the heart of the woman who had once loved him. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't put the letter down. Her words had a gravity all their own, pulling me into a current I had spent years avoiding, a river I had refused to acknowledge because the surface looked too calm, too safe. And yet, the river was there, raging beneath the placid skin of our history, and she had bottled it, handed it to me, and now I could not ignore it. As I turned the pages, one letter after another, the day slipped away. Sunlight faded to amber, then to dusk, and the shadows grew long across the floor, across the box, across the words she had written so carefully. She spoke of the little things, things that seemed trivial at first, how she remembered my laugh in the rain, how she kept the old scarf I left behind, how she imagined my mornings without her presence. But those trivialities carried weight, a subtle reminder that intimacy is built on unnoticed details. Then she spoke of the big things, the moments when we hurt each other without meaning to, the nights she cried quietly in her apartment because she didn't know how to reach me, the nights I slept unaware while she wrestled with the silence between us. Her honesty was a mirror, reflecting not only her own fears and hopes, but also my failures, the parts of me that had withdrawn when love demanded courage. I realized, as I read, that these letters were not meant to punish me. They were not accusations, not lists of grievances, not demands for closure. They were attempts, timid, trembling, yet resolute, to be understood. She had tried to bridge a distance I hadn't even acknowledged existed, had tried to make sense of our past, of herself, of me, through ink and paper. And here I was, decades later, holding that bridge in my hands, trembling at the realization that I could finally cross it, if only I dared. Somewhere in the middle of the third letter, I noticed a shift. The voice I had thought I knew, the playful, frustrated, impatient girl I remembered, was tempered now by clarity, by reflection. She wrote not just of her pain, but of her choices, of the way she had tried to reconcile her heart with reality. There was grace in it, a gentle honesty that I had never been able to give her in life. And yet, there was sorrow too, a kind of sorrow that feels like a quiet river running beneath a frozen surface, deep, cold, and inescapable. I paused, my forehead resting against the folded paper, and for the first time, I wondered if she had ever wanted me to read these letters. Perhaps she had written them solely for herself, to mark the journey from hurt to understanding. Perhaps she had never intended to share them, and yet the universe, or chance, had placed them in my path. The fourth letter was different. It began with a small sketch of two figures, walking side by side but separated by a thin line, and the handwriting was smaller, more precise, more deliberate. She spoke of forgiveness, of the slow work of untangling resentment, of the desire to see someone you loved fully healed, even if it could not be with you. My chest tightened. My mind raced. I had spent years building walls around my heart, convincing myself that some things were unfixable, that some wounds were permanent, that some losses were meant to remain losses. And here she was, reminding me that understanding, even belated, can be its own form of love. I didn't notice the evening pressing against the windows until the room had grown dark. The box sat on my lap, a monument to what had been and what could still be, and I felt the first real stirrings of something I hadn't allowed myself in years: hope. Not the blinding, naive hope of youth, but a quiet, trembling hope that maybe, just maybe, beginnings could follow endings. I read until my eyes stung and my fingers ached, until the letters blurred, and yet I could not stop. Her words had opened doors I thought long closed, doors that led not to the past, not to regret, but to possibility. The last letter, at least the last one I had in the box, was undated, untied, lying slightly apart as though it had been waiting for me to reach at last. It began simply, "I don't know if you will ever read this. I don't know if I want you to. I only know that I needed to say it." The words were so small, so plain, and yet they carried everything. She spoke of letting go, of moving on, of the strange and painful beauty of remembering someone and still wishing them well. I pressed the paper to my chest, closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, felt my heart loosen its grip on regret. Outside, the wind stirred the bare branches against the window, and I realized I wasn't alone. She had returned, not in body, but in voice, and she had come not to haunt, not to blame, not to punish, but to offer understanding, and through it, the chance for me to begin again. I set the letters down gently, as one sets a sleeping child in their bed, and I whispered her name into the quiet room. The shadows receded from the walls, the air felt lighter, the box no longer heavy. I didn't know if she would ever know I had found them, if she would ever know I had read them all, but for the first time, I understood something profound. The past is never truly gone when it has been witnessed, and perhaps, through witness, it can be made whole again. And somewhere inside, I felt the faintest spark of readiness to start over, to speak the words that had once been trapped, and to see her not as a ghost of memory, but as someone who had survived the same journey as I had, and perhaps, finally, someone I could meet again. Each letter I opened felt like a crack in the carefully constructed walls I had built around my heart. The first act of reading had been almost gentle, a slow unfurling of things I could bear to face. But as I progressed, the letters grew sharper, more insistent, demanding attention I wasn't ready to give. She wrote about arguments we'd had, not as accusations, but as attempts to explain the fractures I had ignored for years. I read her words and realized how blind I had been to the subtle ways I pushed her away, the quiet betrayals of indifference, the thoughtless things I had said that had landed like stones in her chest. Each memory rose like smoke from the pages, filling the room with scents and sounds I had long buried. I heard her voice in the words, soft, measured, sometimes trembling, always honest, always searching for understanding. And yet, understanding alone wasn't enough. Her letters uncovered more than memories. They uncovered truths about myself I had refused to see. I began to feel dizzy, as though the floor beneath me had tilted, and I was sliding down a slope I had once climbed confidently. I had thought the past was behind me, that the weight of mistakes could be set aside like old coats in a closet, but now it pressed against my chest like the first breath of winter, sharp and unyielding. I wanted to stop reading. I wanted to shove the letters back into the box, tie the ribbon tightly, and pretend I had never found them. But my hands moved against my will, turning page after page, discovering more fragments of her life, of our life together, that I had ignored. She spoke of nights spent alone, watching the rain trace lines on the window, thinking about the things she wanted to say but couldn't. She wrote about longing, about fear, about the quiet realization that love sometimes fails not because it isn't enough, but because we are too small, too fragile to hold it fully. My chest ached. I had remembered our laughter, our late-night conversations, our shared silences, but I had never remembered the weight she carried in those same moments, the small betrayals of circumstance, of inattention, of self-preservation. And then she began to write of the days after we parted, the days I had thought she had forgotten. She chronicled her attempts to understand why we had failed, her efforts to forgive not just me but herself, her struggle with the hollow ache of absence. There was bitterness there, yes, but it was tempered by honesty, by reflection, by a desire to reconcile with what had been and what could never be again. And still, it cut me open. I realized, painfully, that the letters were not merely about our shared history. They were about her journey, her survival, her way of making sense of a world in which I had been both a presence and a wound. I wanted to argue with her words, to tell her that she had misremembered, that I had not been as callous as she implied, but the truth, raw and undeniable, was laid bare in the inked lines. And there it was, the cruel, subtle revelation that understanding someone's heart after the fact does not erase the pain endured. The letters began to make me question everything I had convinced myself about love, about time, about closure. Had I truly loved her? Had I truly listened? Or had I only heard what suited me in the moment? These questions echoed in the empty corners of the apartment, bouncing off the walls and leaving me hollow. I realized that reading the letters was no longer a passive act. It demanded reckoning, demanded that I face the consequences of indifference and the small failures that accumulate into a lifetime of regret. And yet, despite the ache, I could not stop. Her words pulled me forward, relentlessly, revealing layer after layer of intimacy, of vulnerability, of humanity. I began to see patterns I had ignored, small acts of selflessness, of courage, of quiet endurance. She had loved with a ferocity I had taken for granted, and the more I read, the more I understood the depth of what I had let slip away. There was also frustration, though. Letters that hinted at moments when I might have reached her, when one word, one gesture, one acknowledgement could have bridged the widening chasm between us, and I had not acted. The weight of possibility, of lost chances, pressed down on me, making it difficult to breathe. At night, I dreamed of conversations that never happened, of apologies that were never voiced, of embraces that never came. The letters became a haunting, a quiet insistence that I acknowledge what I had ignored in life as well as love. And in the middle of this growing storm of reflection, a single realization cut through everything. The letters were not meant to punish me. They were meant to illuminate, to guide, to show me a path I had been too blind to see. Each line was a lantern in the darkness, a fragile flicker of understanding that demanded recognition. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if her words had stripped away the defenses I had carefully cultivated for decades. Yet the exposure was not only terrifying, it was liberating. For the first time, I could see the contours of our past clearly, without distortion or denial. I could trace the shape of her heart alongside my own, and the symmetry of our mistakes and intentions became painfully clear. I wanted to reply. I wanted to take the letters, tear them open again, and write the words I should have spoken years ago. But I knew she might never read them, might never know that I had understood, might never acknowledge the second chance offered not in gesture, but in reflection. And that knowledge made the ache sharper still. Her letters became a mirror I could not look away from, reflecting not only the tenderness and hurt she had carried, but also the parts of myself I had hidden even from me. I began to question the choices I had made, the people I had become, the moments I had overlooked. I realized that understanding her was not enough. I had to understand myself, and that path was steep, uneven, and fraught with the possibility of failure. Days passed, or perhaps only hours. I lost track of time. While I sat with the box, surrounded by the evidence of a love that had never been fully expressed, a connection that had been severed by my own shortcomings. Each letter demanded engagement, demanded that I confront my own silence and the quiet cowardice that had kept me from acting when it mattered most. By the time I reached the middle of the stack, I was exhausted, emotionally raw, yet also strangely awake, as if her words had breathed life into corners of my heart that had lain dormant, frozen by fear and neglect. I began to see her not only as a figure from my past, but as a person in her own right, with depth, complexity, and courage. She had survived the aftermath of our shared history, and through these letters, she demanded that I confront not only what was lost, but what might still be possible if I had the courage to act. And so I read, night after night, consumed by the dual ache of regret and revelation, caught between mourning what had been and imagining what could yet be. The letters had become a force, a presence in my life that refused to be ignored, and I understood with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating. To confront them was to confront myself, and only by doing so could I hope to find a way forward, whether together or apart. The tension was unbearable, the emotional current relentless, and yet, amid the swirl of memory, sorrow, and illumination, I could feel the faintest pulse of possibility, a whisper that perhaps the past need not dictate the future, and that in the quiet honesty of words, even letters never sent, there was a chance for understanding, for reckoning, for beginning again. By the time I reached the third week of reading, the letters had become a map of her inner world, a landscape I had never fully explored, and I realized I was not equipped to navigate it alone. I needed context, a perspective beyond my own guilt and longing. And that's when I reached out to someone I had never imagined I would, her best friend, Mara. I had avoided contact with her for years, thinking that revisiting any part of that life would only deepen the ache. But now, desperate for clarity, I picked up the phone. Mara answered after the second ring, her voice cautious but warm. I hesitated, fumbling for words I wasn't sure I had. And then, with a trembling exhale, I admitted the truth, that I had found the letters, that I had read them, that I was drowning in revelations that I couldn't face alone. There was a pause on the other end, a moment of silence that felt longer than any of the years that had passed. And then she said something I hadn't expected. I thought you might find them. She trusted you, even when you weren't aware of it. The words struck me with the force of recognition. Someone else had seen her struggle, had understood the depth of what she had endured, and had preserved it for a day when I might finally be ready. Mara became my guide through the labyrinth of her thoughts, offering context, filling in the silent spaces, explaining small gestures and fleeting moments that the letters hinted at but never fully revealed. She spoke of the nights my ex had cried alone, the quiet ways she had tried to reach me, the times she had almost given up, only to pick herself up again. With each conversation, the letters gained dimension, the inked lines taking on color and texture, becoming more than words. They became a living narrative, a story of resilience, longing, and an attempt at closure that had been stalled for too long. And then, amid the details Mara provided, a discovery. One letter I had not yet seen, the one I had assumed missing, had been intentionally withheld, left in the box not because she had forgotten it, but because she had wanted me to find it at the right moment. It was small, unassuming, the paper yellowed at the edges, and yet it contained a truth that shifted everything. She had written it not for me, not even for herself, but for someone she knew I would become if I allowed myself to confront the past fully. A man capable of understanding, of empathy, of truly seeing her. The letter revealed her hopes for reconciliation, her fears of being misunderstood, and the quiet courage it had taken to let go without bitterness. It was both a gift and a challenge, and I felt its weight pressing against my chest. Mara encouraged me to write back, not for her, not even for the letters themselves, but for the act of acknowledgement, the recognition of what had been lost and what might yet be possible. At first, I resisted. How could I find the words that matched the honesty and vulnerability she had poured onto those pages? How could I confront the years of silence and indifference that had separated us without shattering the fragile bridge of understanding these letters had built? And yet, the urge to respond grew, subtle at first, then insistent, until it became a need that could not be ignored. I began to draft messages I would never send, writing and rewriting, pouring my own reflection, regret, and hope onto blank sheets of paper. It was a strange, cathartic process, almost like speaking aloud in an empty room, the sound of my own voice echoing back at me, revealing truths I had avoided in solitude. One evening, after hours spent with letters spread around me like autumn leaves, I realized that the bridge between us was no longer one-sided. Mara had shown me that she had already crossed it, in her own way, through her writing, through her bravery, through the deliberate act of letting me see her perspective. And I could either remain on the other side, staring at the letters as relics of a past I could not change, or I could step forward, finally acknowledging her, finally acknowledging myself. There was no guarantee of reconciliation, no promise that our paths would merge again, but there was clarity, and with clarity came agency, a choice I had never had when I was living in the fog of ignorance and pride. I took the missing letter in my hands, and for the first time, felt a sense of completion. Not completion in the sense of a happily ever after, but completion in the sense that the narrative had been fully revealed, that the contours of her struggle and her courage were clear, and that I could face it with honesty. Mara's presence, though fleeting, had transformed the reading of the letters from a private act of mourning into an active engagement with history, with memory, and with the possibility of understanding. I began to see her not as a ghost of memory, not as a figure trapped in regret, but as a person who had acted with intention, who had faced the same questions, who had chosen honesty over avoidance, courage over comfort. And in that recognition, I found a strange, tender shift in myself. I was no longer only a man haunted by words never said. I was a man learning to listen, to reflect, to act with awareness, and to open the possibility of response, whether or not she would ever see it. That night, I wrote a final draft I never intended to mail, folding the paper carefully and placing it atop the box of letters. I let it rest there, a symbol of acknowledgement, a promise to myself, a gesture of respect for the person who had loved me deeply enough to be patient, observant, and brave. For the first time, the box did not feel heavy. It felt alive, charged with the presence of her mind and heart, and with the knowledge that understanding, once reached, transforms not only the receiver, but also the one who dares to receive. The discovery of her missing letter, her trust in timing, and the guidance of someone who had known her in ways I never could had created a bridge I had never expected, a connection not of immediate reunion, but of profound recognition. And as I sat there, surrounded by her words and the faint lamplight, I realized that the next act of our story would require courage of a different sort, one born not from reading, but from living, from stepping into the world that awaited beyond the ink and paper, and perhaps, one day, meeting her with the awareness that we had both survived the past, and that the present might still offer a chance to rewrite it. The letters had opened doors I wasn't sure I was ready to walk through, and now, standing at the edge of all that revelation, I felt the ground shift beneath me. The realization of what I had lost, the time, the moments, the chances, hit like a tidal wave, leaving me gasping, unsteady, almost unable to breathe. The letters had been a lantern, yes, illuminating her heart and my own, but suddenly, the light cast shadows that seemed larger than the room itself, shadows of regret that stretched beyond comprehension. I tried to write again, tried to find words that could convey understanding, apology, hope, but the paper refused to hold them, blotting them out with the weight of decades. It was as if the universe itself reminded me that some things cannot be fixed by words alone. I reread the letters, searching for a clue, a phrase, a hint that might guide me through the maze of my guilt, and every line seemed to mock me with the things I had ignored, the opportunities one had let slip. Mara's voice, steady and guiding in the background, could not reach through the swell of my own despair. I felt isolated, adrift in a sea of memory and emotion, tethered only by the fragile ink that traced her journey. The apartment around me seemed smaller, oppressive, the walls closing in as if to remind me that time is merciless, that absence can be permanent, and that understanding alone does not undo the hurt caused by neglect. I thought of the moments I had taken for granted, the mornings I had ignored, the nights I had slept while she wrestled with her own heartbreak. Each memory pressed down, a weight that made my chest ache, my thoughts fractured and relentless. I wanted to scream, to curse fate, to tear the letters into pieces and yet somehow hold them all together, but my hands were trembling, powerless against the gravity of what I faced. I remembered her face in fragments, the curve of her smile, the tilt of her head when she listened, the quiet sorrow in her eyes, and felt a sharp, piercing ache. She had returned to me not in body, not in presence, but in essence, in thought, in truth, and I could not grasp it, could not reconcile the reality of her absence with the intensity of her letters. Nights stretched endlessly. Sleep was a stranger. I wandered the apartment, touching the letters as if I could absorb her courage through my fingertips, and yet each attempt left me emptier, more aware of the chasm that separated our present from what might have been. Friends reached out, asked how I was, but their words fell flat, meaningless against the emotional storm that had claimed me. Mara's calls became lifelines, and still, even with her voice on the line, I could not anchor myself. I saw the letters differently now, not as guides, not as bridges, but as mirrors reflecting every failure, every inadequacy, every moment I had not been enough. And the collapse was not sudden. It was gradual, creeping, like winter seeping into bone. I questioned every choice I had made, every word left unsaid, every step that had led me away from her. Even hope seemed fragile, a candle flickering against a gale, threatening to go out with the smallest breath. Then came the moment I had feared. The box of letters slipped from the table during one of my restless nights. The papers scattered across the floor, some bent, some torn at the edges, and I felt the full weight of loss in a physical way, as if the universe had arranged a small demonstration of what I had allowed to unravel in my own life. I sank to my knees, gathering the letters, and felt tears spill freely. The ache was no longer just memory. It was corporeal, tangible, a reminder that love, once fractured, cannot always be mended by reflection alone. In the chaos, I discovered something, a letter I had overlooked, wedged beneath the others, edges curling, slightly damp with a faint tear I had not caused. Its presence startled me, and I recognized immediately that it contained the turning point, the words she had held back for me to discover only when I was ready to confront the full magnitude of our past. And yet, even as I read, the collapse continued. I realized that understanding, even clarity, cannot erase the years lost, the conversations never had, the embraces never shared. It was a bitter pill, and I swallowed it with trembling hands, knowing that I could not turn back the clock, could not restore what had been broken. The room felt empty, yet full, haunted by the echoes of her writing, the remnants of her thoughts, the weight of my own silence. In that emptiness, I faced a choice: succumb to despair, allow the past to crush what remained of my spirit, or gather the fragments, the letters, the memories, the faint hope, and attempt to piece together a path forward. It was terrifying. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to avoid further pain, to ignore the letters and pretend the discovery had never happened. But a quieter, insistent voice whispered otherwise. That collapse is not the end. That reckoning, though brutal, is a necessary precursor to understanding, to renewal, to the faint glimmer of possibility that life may yet offer. I stayed on the floor that night, surrounded by letters, by shadows, by silence, and I cried, not just for her, not just for us, but for myself, for the years spent blind, for the courage I had yet to summon. And in the midst of that collapse, as the first light of dawn touched the room, I realized that hitting the bottom was, paradoxically, the first step toward rising. The letters, once a bridge, had become a mirror. I had seen not only her truth but my own, and now, at the nadir, I could choose to confront it, or let it consume me. The fear, the regret, the weight of absence, they were all real, undeniable, and yet, even in the wreckage, I sensed the faintest pulse of what might come next. A chance, fragile and uncertain, to move beyond collapse, to step into the possibility of action, and to discover whether what had been lost could somehow, in a different form, be reclaimed. The morning she arrived, the city felt suspended, caught between the memory of yesterday and the possibility of today. I hadn't expected her, Not really. I had imagined her only in letters, in the careful strokes of ink that carried her voice across time. But there she was, framed in the doorway, familiar and strange all at once, as if the years and the distance had folded into a single, impossible moment. I could see it in her eyes, the same depth, the same quiet courage I had felt in her writing. And I realized instantly that she had returned not to relive the past, but to release it, and maybe, to let me release it too. I wanted to speak, to say everything the letters had demanded I understand, but words failed me, collapsing under the weight of years and regret. She smiled, a soft, almost imperceptible curve of the lips, and I felt something shift inside, a pulse of recognition, an acknowledgement that the story was no longer only on paper. It was here, alive, shared, immediate. We moved toward each other cautiously, like dancers learning steps long forgotten, each hesitant motion loaded with the gravity of what had been lost. And then the words came, tentative at first. I admitted the truth, that I had read the letters, that I had understood, that I had wrestled with the years I had thrown away, the moments I had failed to seize. She nodded, eyes glistening, and spoke not of accusation, but of her own journey, of her struggle to forgive, to let go, to find peace with what had happened. It was the first time in a long time that our voices met without the filter of memory, without the safety of paper, without the distance that had kept us protected and imprisoned simultaneously. The air between us was taut, charged with all the things left unsaid, the words we had hidden in letters and in silence. I reached for her hand, almost afraid she would withdraw, but she allowed it, bridging the final gap, not with words, but with presence. Time seemed suspended. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent, but in that small apartment, history and possibility collided, and the air shimmered with the weight of unspoken understanding. And yet, the choice was mine. I could cling to the shadows of the past, to the letters that had opened the door, or I could step fully into the present, into her presence, with the courage that had taken decades to summon. I inhaled sharply, feeling the letters in my mind, the hours spent reading, reflecting, reckoning, and I realized that this was the moment they had been leading to, not just recognition, but action. I spoke, haltingly, of starting again, not erasing what had been, but building something new, something honest, something rooted in awareness and vulnerability. She listened, eyes fixed on mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of hope, not just in myself, but in her. She reached for the box of letters I had left on the floor, flipping through them with care, touching each one lightly, as if acknowledging their role, their significance, and then she looked up, meeting my gaze fully. No words were necessary. The letters had spoken, the years had passed, and now, only the moment remained. I realized that our reunion was not a promise of perpetual happiness, not a guarantee of smooth roads, but a chance to be present, to honor the past while embracing the potential of what lay ahead. I felt the weight of the letters lift, the pressure of regret ease slightly, and a quiet clarity settled over me. Love, even delayed, even fractured, can still demand courage and attention, and sometimes that is enough. The afternoon sun fell across the room, warm and steady, and for a fleeting, infinite instant, nothing else existed but us. The letters, the truth, and the fragile, luminous possibility of beginning again. And in that fragile light, I understood the true gift she had given me. Not a path back to her, not an easy reconciliation, but the chance to confront, to understand, to choose, and to meet her fully, without the veil of the past clouding our sight. And so I took a step forward, closing the distance that had haunted me for years, and for the first time, I felt ready, not just to hear her, not just to see her, but to begin, with all the weight and wonder of what had been and what might still be. The room was quiet now, the letters stacked neatly in their box, the ribbon tied loosely, as if acknowledging the closure they had brought without demanding more. I sat on the edge of the sofa, hands folded over the box, feeling the residual weight of all that had passed, the missed chances, the regrets, the moments suspended in ink and memory, and yet, beneath it, a strange lightness, a sense of possibility that I had never expected to find. She moved around the apartment with a careful grace, touching familiar surfaces, pausing in front of photographs, in front of the window where the late afternoon sun slanted across the floor. She didn't speak immediately, and neither did I. Silence, for once, was not empty. It was shared, charged with understanding, with presence, with acknowledgement of what had been and what could be. I realized then that the letters had done their work. They had guided us back, not to the past we had lost, but to each other in the present, in the fragile space of recognition, reconciliation, and choice. I felt compelled to open the box again, slowly lifting the lid, tracing the edges of each envelope with a fingertip. Each letter seemed to whisper fragments of her voice, echoes of courage, vulnerability, and honesty. I smiled faintly, a gesture at once private and shared, and set the box down gently, deciding not to reread them now. They had spoken. It was time to live with their lessons, not dwell in them. She watched me with quiet curiosity, as if sensing the small victory of this decision, and then she reached out, taking my hand without ceremony. Her grip was firm, grounding, and I understood that this was the acknowledgement I had longed for. Not words, not confessions, but simple presence, shared space, and a mutual willingness to continue. We moved to the window, looking out over the city streets below, where life carried on, oblivious to the private reckoning that had just unfolded in our small apartment. And in that moment, the past felt like a shadow, present but no longer binding, its lessons absorbed into the fabric of our awareness, its aches softened by understanding. I thought of the letters again, of the painstaking care with which she had written them, the courage it had taken to articulate thoughts she might never send, and I understood that the gift had never been about reconciliation alone. It had been about honesty, about the willingness to confront one's own heart, about offering another person the chance to see fully, without distortion, without fear. And now, having read, having reflected, having faced the collapse and climbed toward clarity, I felt a quiet gratitude, not just toward her, but toward myself, for daring to receive, to witness, to respond in whatever way the present allowed. We spoke then, slowly, deliberately, about small things, about the life that had continued in our absence, about the people and moments that had shaped us. We did not rush into declarations of what might happen next. There was no need. The letters had taught patience, reflection, and the value of space between words and actions. And in that deliberate slowness, a new rhythm emerged, fragile but undeniable. We began to share stories, laughter, small confessions, and gestures of intimacy that felt earned, authentic, and unhurried. Outside, the light shifted from golden to soft gray, and the room filled with the quiet hum of the city below. The box of letters remained between us, a silent witness, a testament to what had been endured and what had been understood. For the first time in years, I felt that the past and present could coexist without conflict, that memory and reality could harmonize rather than clash, and that the act of seeing someone fully and allowing oneself to be seen was itself a form of healing. She looked at me then, eyes steady and kind, and I realized that the ending we had feared had never been the point. The point had been the journey, the confrontation, the reckoning, the courage to witness and respond. And now, with the letters resting in their box and our hands entwined, I understood the quiet power of beginning again, not as a erasure of the past, but as a continuation shaped by understanding, reflection, and choice. We left the apartment together soon after, stepping into the late afternoon light, neither rushing nor hesitating, but walking side by side, aware of the fragility of the moment, and yet filled with a sense of possibility that shimmered quietly, persistently, like the final line of a letter finally read and understood. And somewhere in the soft cadence of our steps, in the unspoken acknowledgement between us, I felt that the letters had not merely returned her to me. They had returned me to myself, prepared to meet the world and her with clarity, courage, and the quiet hope of what might still come. The box remained behind, unopened, not forgotten, but honored, a repository of truth, love, and the endurance of the human heart. And as we walked, side by side, I realized that some letters, though never sent, carry within them a power greater than delivery, the power to transform, to illuminate, and to allow us, finally, to begin again.